Today's quilt is this beautiful little Ohio star. You'll see how easy it is to create it without ever cutting or sewing a triangle unit. We'll be learning option 1, option 3, and how to put a quilt on point. To create our little quilt today, the Ohio Star, we'll need to learn how to make the option 1 and the option 3 triangle units. You can see here on our block, this is the little Ohio Star block that we'll be creating, and it's a 6-inch square sewn, meaning 6.5 inch with the raw edges on it. The option 1s are in the center of each one of the blocks, and we will be creating 12 blocks for our quilt, so that means we'll need to make 12 of these. And then this unit here is our flying geese, which is the option 3, and they will go around to make the actual points of the star. And our option 3 starts out looking like this, and we get 2 flying geese out of the unit, so that means 2 of these will be required for each block. And then, of course, in the corners, just a little square here. So let's get started with our option 1s, the center of our Ohio Star. And I have chosen a fabric with multiple colors in it that's kind of a large print. So sometimes you'll get one that has more of the background color in it, and then in others it may turn out to be more of what the big flower is. So think about that when you're choosing your fabrics, to make sure that they show up in the quilt or in the block the way you want to. If it's a small block, maybe a big print isn't what you're wanting. But for this one, this is exactly the way I want it. So you'll just start out cutting your strips that go around your square. And of course, this is what it looks like here before we get it all trimmed up. This is our basic square. And we'll start out with a square in the middle that's 2 5/8, and that's your cut size. And if we have 12 blocks and there's one of these in each center, then that means we'll need 12 of these squares that are 2 5/8. And then the strips that we sew around the side are 1 3/4, and of course that's the red piece, so that would be our red fabric. So after you have your squares and strips cut, then you're ready to start sewing those in the machine. And you can see here how I'm taking the selvage edge of my strip and starting it in my machine just a little bit. You can also see in my machine here how I have a little scrap runner or a little extra piece of fabric in there. I always start or stop with my scrap runner. I don't ever leave my machine empty. It just keeps your thread and your bobbin and everything running together nicely, so you don't have to waste time threading and clipping and cleaning out the different areas of your machine. We call it smoking needle chain sewing, because you just can piece those pieces together so quickly and don't have to take the time to stop to mess with your machine. Your strips can be however long you want them to be. If you're working with fat quarters, they may be about 18 to 22 inches. If you're working with yard goods, it can be the 40 to 44 inches long. Or if you're working with scraps, if you're making a real scrap quilt, then they may just be 6 inches or any length. So start your strip in the machine. Make sure you're sewing your scant 1/4 of an inch, and then all your little squares that you have cut. Of course, your strip is right side up, your square is right side down. Don't stop and pick up your foot. Just add your square to your piece and continue sewing all the way through that square till you get to the end. Remember, make sure you sew a scant 1/4 of an inch. Now I'm sewing with a dark thread today so that you can see it as I'm working, but you'll want a neutral color thread. The grays, the creams, and even some khaki colors are great ones to work with in the top and in the bobbin. You can see how I didn't stop to lift up my foot. I sewed all the way through or to the end of my square, and then I stop. I also have an automatic needle down on this machine, and I really like to stop with that needle down each time. Just continue to put all 12 of your squares on your strip just like this. And this is side 1. We're sewing a strip on side 1 of our square. Now maybe you'll have some fabric left over at the end when you get through getting your 12 on here. We're going to play like I have all 12 on my strip, and I still have a little bit left, because if I had worked with fabric that was the full selvage length of the 40 to 45 inches, I would have some left. My next step would be to sew a strip on side 2. So what I want to do is go back here and just clip off my squares. So just separate your square, and I can leave this last one in here and come back and pick him up later. Continue to hang on to him, don't turn him loose, and come around and lay it down. And now you're sewing on side 2. Now for the project we're working on today, we want the same color on all 4 sides. So it's okay to bring it around and put it on the same strip. Now, if you needed to start a different color of strip, then you would have clipped that one off and started your new one, and then bring your squares around to sew down on the strip. And you can see here how I have side 1 on and side 2, and I have enough left here on my strip that I can go ahead and come back here and pick up this little one I had left and clip him off and just bring him around. So we want to chain piece these together and do it as neatly and as quickly as possible, sewing a scant 1/4 of an inch, and just sew all the way through. Now, if I was ready to get these out of the machine, I could clip off or pick up a new little fabric scrap and run it in here. That way my machine won't be empty. That way I'm not having to deal with a bunch of threads or worrying about my machine coming unthreaded from either direction. Now, my next step will be to separate these pieces. So you can do that with your scissors, or you can do it with your rotary cutter, and you just have to separate the sections. And I always do this with the squares up and the strips on the bottom. And if you have some extra left over on the end, go ahead and trim it up a little bit. Now, you may want to go ahead and go in and square these up perfectly, but you don't have to do that. So unless you're having a hard time being accurate, don't take the time to do it. Then your next step will be to press these open just like this. And I'm saying press open because I'm taking my iron and I'm sliding it and I'm pressing these strips open because they were shut. And when you do that, you can see here how on the back your seams will go away from the center square. So no matter what color you're working with, always press it so that center square is flat and the seams go out or away from that center square. Now, after our piece looks like this, we're ready to sew side 3 and side 4 on. So side 3 needs to go here and side 4 needs to go here. And the way that you do that, and you can see on this piece here how I have side 3 already sewn on. And once again, you want to just chain feed those through the machine. Now, these are 2 I already have clipped or separated off from each other, but these you can see how they are all chained together, and we just fed those in the machine, so they would have gone in the machine like this with the short strip on top. Now, these short strips you can get by going to your mat and cutting your strips with a rotary cutter. And they don't have to go all the way through here. They have to cover the center square. So if this was 2 5/8, this strip would have to be at least 2 5/8 inches long. But if I take the time to make sure that I cut those perfectly 2 5/8, then I have to make sure I take the time to lay them on here perfectly so they cover. See, if you make them just a little bit bigger, you can just put them down and continue sewing and feeding those through the machine without taking the time to make sure they're perfectly over that square. Remember, we call this chain piecing, and it's the smoking needle style. We want to get through this as accurately and as quickly as possible. So you just continue to add those little squares to or strips to the top of your squares and feed those through the machine. Then the next thing you want to do is to go back and sew on side 4 on that strip. So you would just take your piece and start it in your machine just like we've been doing through the whole project. Now, you may have this little extra piece coming off the edge here because when we trimmed those and cut those apart, we left a little bit here on the edge. So see, when you open and press those up, you have a little bit coming off of the edges here. So when you start your foot, you want to make sure that it's even with your square because that's where all your sizing is coming from. So I've started sewing and my foot is right here where it will line up perfectly with the square. So I'll have a little extra hanging off here. Sometimes that confuses people and sometimes it doesn't bother them at all. And of course you can go in and clean those up so that they're perfectly on there. Now, after you have all of side 3 and 4 on, and here you can see how we've just chain fed these through the machine and see how they're all connected and see how the strip is just covering the center square. It doesn't have to cover all of it. Then you can once again take your rotary cutter or your scissors and just snip those threads and you're ready to press open. After you have them all pressed open, you're ready to do your trimming for your option 1, which is the center unit that makes up your block. And here we have some of these already ready to go. And you just want to make sure they're pressed nice and neat, and then you're ready to take your tool to trim them up. And of course you want the tip of the 90 to be right in the tip of that center square with your black lines right over the seam and your grid line going right through the point. When you do that to all 4 sides, that's your option 1, and here you can see how it looks after we get it all trimmed up, and that will go in the center of our little Ohio star that you're working with. Now see how easy it is to get those triangle units in the center of that star? We didn't have to cut or sew any of them. Okay, let's trim up our little option 1 blocks that is our center of our star, and then we'll jump into making our flying geese, which is the option 3. So to do the trimming for the option 1, the square and a square block, you want to make sure that the tip of the 90 is right in the tip of the square. The black lines just go right over the seam, just like this, and this heavy grid line goes right through the point. When you do your trimming here, you can see how that leaves your perfect 1/4 of an inch. And of course you want to do that to all 4 sides, creating your option 1 block that goes right in the center. So the tip of the 90 right in the tip of the square, black lines over the seam, trimming it up. Now when you do all 4 corners, this is your option 1, and that will go in the center. Now our next piece that we need to create is our little flying geese block. And of course we sew our squares just like we did before, with our square in the middle and our strips on the side. But we're switching our colors around a little bit because remember, this is our block here that we're working on, and this is our flying geese that will be the points of our star. This is the center square, and that's a background fabric. It can be dark if your star's light, but in ours today we have a light background, and we have the blue strips that make the points of the star. The square will be 3 inches in the center, a cut size, and of course your strips can be the same size as we used before, the 1 3/4 inch, and we want to sew a strip on each side. So let's kind of review how we do that. We start out with our strip in the sewing machine, sewing a little bit and then attaching our squares all the way down the side, leaving about a finger space in between, and just sewing all the way down for however long our strip is. Then the next thing we do is we want to put a strip on side 2. So once again, we just attach and sew the strip all the way down, making the blocks all in this chain piecing fashion. Then we cut these apart, and you can trim up your edges, trim up your little tails just like this, and then separate your units. You can do it with your scissors or with your rotary cutter. Now you don't necessarily have to have these all trimmed up even, but if you want to do it, go right ahead, and if not, it'll all work out just the same. I don't do it to mine. I want to save my time. Then once again we press, and I always say press open, meaning you open up your unit and press, and the seams go out or away from the center square. Now after we have our blocks all pressed and looking like this, we're ready to go in and sew on side 3 and 4. Now on our other piece that we did, our option 1, I didn't actually sew any of those side 3 and 4s on, but for this one I want to show you, go ahead and sew a couple of those and show you how to do it. Now I've just cut some short strips. We talked about how they just have to cover that center square, just a little bit left over on each side. If our center square is 3, our strips must be at least 3 inches. But if we take the time to cut them 3 inches, then we have to take the time to make sure they're on here perfectly. We want our work to be accurate, but we also want it to be speedy. So we make it just a little bit bigger, and we can just quickly put it on, not worrying about if it's perfectly over the square. Once again, sewing a nice 1/4 of an inch right along the edge. You want your strips and your squares to be nice and even, and that's where you base your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. You can see here how we have this extra little piece coming off here, so you wouldn't want your foot to line up along there. You wouldn't have room to get moved over, and it would mess up your sizing of your block. And that is side 3. Basically, you do the same thing for side 4. So let's look at our pieces here where we've chain pieced these through the machine with our side 3 all the way across, and then we'll just repeat it for the opposite side, doing side 4 and just chain piecing these through the machine just in long pieces, and then we press them open and we're ready to do our trimming. Now our trimming for our flying geese are just a little bit different because we're cutting our unit in half. You can see here how we trim it up and then cut it in half to get our 2 perfect flying geese. So our block must be trimmed like this. You can see here how we left the 1/4 of an inch off of these 2 sides opposite of each other, but on these 2 we have to trim right up to the tip because we're slicing it in half. That means we have to move these points and seam allowances, and trimming up to the tip allows us to do that. So let's go ahead and trim our little block here, our flying geese, the option 3. Now once again, you want to put the tip of the 90 right in the tip of the square. The black lines go right over the seam, and your grid line should go right through the point, and you trim this off. See how if you had left this strip long and went all the way to the end here, you would have more that you're trimming off. So you really don't want your strips any longer than what they have to be, because that's just excess on the end there. So go to the opposite side, lining it up exactly the same way, trimming it, and that leaves that perfect 1/4 of an inch off of those two sides. Now on the other two, we want to trim right up to the tip. So I always tell my students to go ahead and put the 90 in there, because that'll help you get your bearings as to where you're at, and then slide over 2 more lines. And so this is the one it's on, so slide over 1 more and then 2 more. And the end or the tip of the line is right in the end of the tip of that sewn center square. Black line over the seam, go back to the point, and see here how your grid line floats right through the point. This was our heavy grid line that we used when we had the 90 in the tip, leaving the 4th, but now we're trimming up to the tip, so we have to move over 1 more grid line. Trimming it up, and you can see here how that trimmed right up to the tip. None of this white square is over here on this piece that I've trimmed off, and I don't have a blunted area here. So make sure you put the tip of the line right in the tip of the square. Tip of the line, tip of the square, moving it over. It's right in there, black line over the seam, grid line right to the point. When all of the lines line up perfectly like this, you know that you did a nice job cutting your squares and your strips, and you should have a nice accurate block. Now the next thing we want to do is to just slice this in half. Now anytime you've trimmed right up to the tip like we did here, that's a clue or a hint for you that at some point in time you're going to be cutting through that unit to create separate units. And you can see here how I have nice, perfect flying geese, and 2 of them for the work of 1. When I sew a 1/4 of an inch here, of course there's my point. When I sew here a 1/4 and there a 1/4, there's my perfect 1/4 of an inch seam right in there. So the next thing we need to do is we're ready to start piecing our block together. So here's our points that will go on the outside edges of our star, and 2 blocks got us all 4 of these flying geese. And of course this option 1 goes in the center. And then we have these little squares that are cut 2 inches that fit right in these corners. Now, used to when I would see quilts that had these cute little stars in them like this, I would just want to run right home and make one. But then I would get set down at my machine and I would get started on it, and my work wouldn't be as speedy as I wanted it to be, and it wouldn't be as accurate as I wanted it to be. And I wound up not finishing the project because I lost interest, because it didn't move along and it didn't look the way I wanted it to. But doing it this way with the center square and the strips on it and using a specialty tool to trim it up, I get perfect triangle units, and I didn't have to go bald pulling my hair out trying to worry how to get all those perfect points and triangles where I wanted them to be. Now that we want to sew these together in segments, you can see how this one is sewn together, and we would want to sew 2 like that. So these along the bottom and here, and then these 3 together. Now the other thing that I like to do that helps speed it up is I don't use pins when I sew. I use this stiletto. Now this brass one is my favorite one. The shaft is the perfect size I need to hold my pieces like pins, and the sharpness is what I need to actually pierce through all of those layers of fabric. So let's go ahead and start by sewing our end piece together. And so you just want to put these, line them up perfectly, your little square, with your flying goose. And I like to, anytime I have a solid square, I want that to go on the bottom, and I want my pieced unit to go on the top. You can see here how I'm just sewing very slowly and using my stiletto to help feed it through the machine. And of course, pick up your next one, and you just always chain piece. You don't ever stop and take all of those pieces out. You just continue to feed them through the machine, coming back and picking them up. If I ever want to get everything out of the machine, then I use a little scrap runner to sew into the machine like I have here. I would pick up my little scrap and sew it in the machine, and then I could take everything out. Now after you have your pieces sewn together in rows, then you just attach them to each other. And of course, when you put these sides together, you want your seams to butt up nice and neat together and your seams here. And just use your stiletto to help feed it through the machine so it will go in there perfectly. And then you'll have your great little star all pieced together nice and perfect, and it won't be a hassle or a headache trying to get all those triangle units or pieces put together. Just use that stiletto to feed it through the machine. Now when we come up next, we'll show you how to set the quilt together by putting the block on point. Anytime you put your block on point, it makes your block look more intricate and harder than maybe what it really was. Now you'll want 12 of these to make your quilt, and you'll be almost finished and ready to go. Remember to press your blocks good. It makes them look professional. For our tips and hints today, we want to talk about setting our quilt blocks on point. And what that means is that our quilt block will have the corners or the tips or the points at the up and down position. They won't be placed in rows where the block is square or flat or horizontal going through the quilt. Now you want to make sure that your block that is being sewn next to it is the same size as your pieced block. And we know that our piece blocks don't always turn out to be the size that we're looking for. They may be a little larger or a little smaller. So I try to make sure that I cut these squares, we call them setting squares, after I have the piecing done of the actual quilt blocks. That way they can fit together perfectly. And then I like to lay my quilt out and just put my blocks tip to tip like this and go as wide as you need to and then as long as you need to for the quilt that you're making. The next thing I do is to cut my corners and my side pieces. Now a lot can be done with color. I'm going to use a different color in the center for my setting blocks as to what I use on my outside edges, and it looks like that it's a border that I've added to the block when it's really just part of the setting. Now for these corner units here, it's important that we have the outside straight of the grain pieces on the outside edges of the block and that we have the bias edge in here. So for the corners, of course, we need 4. We have 4 corners. We need 4 of these triangle units. And we can only get 2 out of the square. That way that the straight of the grains are put where we need them to be and the bias are. So you would cut your square tip to tip, and you would need 2 of them to get the required 4 here, and then that is sewn to the outside edges of the block. And I like to go ahead and sew those to the block and put them in the corners. That way I don't have to worry about getting them mixed up with my other ones or getting the wrong side of the triangle sewn on the wrong side of the block. So I will cut those. I will have to have 2 squares, get my 4 triangles, and attach those to one side of my block for each corner. Now the next thing you'll want to do is to get what I call the side triangle units. And I always like to cut my triangles larger or my squares larger than what I need to. That way when I get them sewn on, I'll have plenty to go back in and trim off or square up after I get the whole quilt put together so that it's nice and perfect. And it just allows you to do that if you cut big and then trim down small. Now for your side units, you can get 4 of the triangle units out of your block. So you can see here how you can get 4 of these out of your unit that you're looking for. And you'll just cut tip to tip and you'll have your 4 units. And here is the placement of it. You'll have 4 of them out of here, just like this, cutting tip to tip and getting 4 out of your block. So you'll have to figure out how many you need according to the size of block that you're working with. I think we need about 10 for the one that we're working on today. Now when you sew your quilt together, you'll separate them out in rows like this so that you won't get confused. Now of course if this is the corner and I already have this triangle sewn on, then I will sew these on, making sure that the bottom edge or the flat edge of that triangle is nice and neat and perfect in the square, and sewing starting here and actually sewing down this direction and then pressing open, and the same thing with here. And that would give you your one top corner and your bottom corner. And then on your other one, on your other corner, you'll just have 1, because see how your rows go this way. Then just sew your blocks together in rows or in long strips and then attach your corner to the next and then this one to the next. It's really not hard to put a quilt together on point. It just takes a little thinking to get it done. But using this method, you'll do it speedy and accurate.